The distress signal was weak. It flickered on Commander's display like a dying heartbeat, barely strong enough to register against the background noise of deep space. Her navigation officer almost dismissed it as sensor error, but something made pause. She was tired. They all were. The quiet passage had been traveling for 3 weeks straight, carrying medical supplies to a colony on the far edge of space. Her crew wanted to go home. They wanted warm food and soft beds and the purple skis of there. Nobody wanted to stop for a distress call on a frozen moon in the middle of nowhere. Looked at the signal again. The species marker showed human. She knew very little about humans. They were a young race, barely 300 years into space travel. Most galactic powers considered them unimportant. They had no great technology, no powerful fleet, no ancient wisdom to share. They were just another species stumbling through the stars, trying to find their place. Her second officer, a young male named, clicked his teeth in the gesture of impatience. "Commander, if we stop now, we will be delayed by at least 6 hours. The colony is waiting for those medical supplies." He was right. The logical choice was to continue. The human ship, whatever had happened to it, was not their responsibility. There were protocols for this sort of thing. They could report the signal to the nearest human outpost and let the humans deal with their own problem. But's grandmother had been a deep space trader too. She had traveled the void for 60 years before retiring to tend her garden on the, and she had taught one thing above all else. The universe was cold and empty and did not care if you lived or died. The only warmth in it came from the choices people made. "Change course," said, "We're stopping." Scales shifted to a frustrated gray, but he obeyed. They found the human ship on the dark side of the moon called Nine. It was a small research vessel, the kind used for scientific surveys. Something had gone terribly wrong with its reactor. The explosion had torn the ship nearly in half, and the remains had crashed into a field of frozen methane. Ice had already begun to cover the wreckage like a burial shroud. Did not expect to find survivors. No one could survive 11 days in a broken ship on a frozen moon. The human body was fragile. They needed warmth and oxygen and food, and this place had none of those things. But the scanner showed a single life sign, faint, failing, but there. She led the rescue team herself. They cut through the frozen hull with plasma torches and crawled through twisted corridors filled with ice. They found the human in what had been the medical bay, wrapped in emergency blankets and huddled against a heating unit that had long since stopped working. She had built a shelter from debris and sealed the cracks with frozen paste made from food rations. She had rationed her oxygen with desperate precision. She had done everything right, and it still hadn't been enough. The human was dying when they found her. Her skin had turned blue from cold. Her fingers were black with frostbite. She was so thin that could see her bones through her skin, but she was alive. They carried her back to the quiet passage and put her in the medical bay. The ship's doctor, an elderly female named, worked on her for hours. She warmed her blood slowly to avoid shock. She treated the frostbite and the dehydration and the oxygen damage to her brain. She fed her through tubes because the human was too weak to swallow. Visited the medical bay every few hours, though she could not have explained why. There was something about the human that bothered her, not in a bad way. She just couldn't stop thinking about what it must have been like. 11 days alone in the dark and cold, watching her oxygen slowly run out, knowing that no one was coming. Most people would have given up. This human had not. On the third day, the human woke up. Was there when it happened. She watched the human's eyes open slowly, saw the confusion and fear as she tried to understand where she was. Then the human saw standing beside her bed, and the fear faded into something else, something that did not recognize at first. "Where am I?" the human asked. Her voice was rough and broken from disuse. "You are on the merchant vessel Quiet Passage. I am Commander. We found you on 9. The human stared at her for a long moment. Then water began to leak from her eyes and run down her cheeks. Had read about this human behavior. They called it crying. It was a response to strong emotion, both positive and negative. They did not do this. They processed grief and joy in other ways. "You saved me," the human said. "Why?" Did not know how to answer. The question seemed strange to her. Why did anyone help anyone? "Because you were dying," she said finally, "and we could help." Most people wouldn't have stopped. Most people would have kept going. This was probably true. Knew how the galaxy worked. Species looked after their own. Resources were limited. Time was valuable. Stopping to help a stranger from a minor species was not logical. It was not efficient. It was not the way things were done. Perhaps said, but we stopped. The human reached out and took his hand. Her grip was weak, but her eyes were bright with something fierce and burning. "My name is, I was studying the microbial life on 9 when my reactor failed." She squeezed his hand harder. "I won't forget this. I won't forget you. I won't forget what you did for me." Felt uncomfortable. She was not used to such intensity from strangers. "It was nothing," she said. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," said, "they wouldn't. That's why it matters." They reached the nearest human outpost 4 days later. Was still weak, but she could walk now. She stood at the airlock as the docking clamps engaged, ready to return to her own people. But before she left, she turned back to one last time. "Among my people," said, "we have a saying, aid a human once and they'll never forget. We remember our debts, we remember our friends." She pressed her hand against his chest over her heart. "I will remember you, I will remember this ship and this crew, and someday, somehow, I will repay this debt." Watched her walk away through the airlock. She assumed it was just words. Humans were emotional creatures. They said things they didn't mean. They made promises they couldn't keep. In a few months would return to her life and forget all about the merchant captain who had pulled her from the ice. Return to her duties, and did not think about the human again. She would think about her later. 32 years later, when the sky was burning and her world was dying and all hope had been lost. But that was still in the future. For now, the quiet passage continued on its journey, and the stars remained cold and silent, and a debt had been created that would one day shake the galaxy to its foundations. Was old now. Her scales had faded from bright green to pale gray, and her joints ached when the weather changed. She had retired from trading 15 years ago and now spent her days tending a small garden behind her dwelling, growing the purple flowers that her grandmother had loved. She had lived a good life. She had traveled the stars for 40 years, seen wonders that most never dreamed of, made friends among a dozen different species. She had raised 3 children and watched them have children of their own. Her youngest granddaughter, a bright young female named, visited her every week to hear stories about the old days. Rarely thought about the human she had saved on 9. It had been 32 years. The memory had faded like an old photograph, the details blurring together until she could barely remember the woman's face. She knew she had done something good once, helped someone who needed helping, but it felt like something that had happened to a different person. Then the came, and everything changed. The Dominion was old and powerful and cruel. They had been conquering worlds for 1,000 years, building an empire on the bones of species too weak to stop them. They had always known about them, had always feared them, but they had believed they were safe. They had nothing they wanted. They had no weapons, no strategic position, no rare resources. They were traders and scholars and artists. They were no threat to anyone. But they did not care about threats. They cared about expansion. They cared about power. They cared about showing the galaxy that no one could stand against them, and that was in their path. The invasion came without warning. One moment the sky was clear and purple the way it had always been. The next moment it was filled with ships, hundreds of them, thousands. They blocked out the sun and cast shadows across the entire continent. Was in her garden when the first bombs fell. She heard the explosions before she saw them, felt the ground shake beneath her feet. Then she looked up and saw fire falling from the sky. The first wave killed 3 billion people. 3 billion. could not comprehend a number that large. It was just words. But she could comprehend the faces of her neighbors as they ran screaming through the streets. She could comprehend the smell of burning buildings and the sound of children crying for parents who would never answer. Her son found her standing frozen in her garden, staring at the sky. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the underground shelter that the government had built decades ago for emergencies that no one believed would ever happen. She went with him because she did not know what else to do. The shelter was crowded and dark and smelled of fear. Hundreds of packed into a space meant for 50, pressing against each other, trying to find comfort in closeness. Found a corner and sat down with her family around her. Her son, her daughter-in-law, her two. They were all she had left. Above them the bombing continued. The ceiling shook with each impact. Dust fell from the cracks. Sometimes the lights flickered and everyone held their breath, waiting to see if the power would fail completely. But it never did. Not yet. On the second day, someone managed to get a communication channel working. They could receive signals from the outside world, though they could not send any. What they heard made blood turn cold. The Galactic Council was aware of the situation. They had received the distress calls. They had seen the images of burning cities and fleeing refugees, and they had decided to do nothing. The invasion was legal, according to galactic law. They had no mutual defense treaties. They had no alliances that required other species to intervene. They were alone, and no one was obligated to help them. Message after message came in from other species. They expressed their sympathy. They sent their condolences. The Pelion Assembly offered to accept refugees if any survived. Everyone was very sorry. No one was sending ships. Listened to these messages and felt something inside her die. She had spent her whole life believing that the galaxy was basically good, that species looked after each other, that when someone was in trouble, others would help. She had stopped to save a dying human on a frozen moon because she believed that was how the universe worked. She had been wrong. On the fourth day, the bombing stopped. For a few hours, the shelter was silent except for the sound of breathing and quiet weeping. Some people thought it was over. Some people thought they had won and were preparing to land troops to finish the job. No one knew anything. Then the communication channel crackled to life again, and a new voice came through. It was speaking Galactic Common, the trade language that all species used, but with an accent that had not heard in 32 years. This is Admiral of the United Human Systems Navy, commanding the Terran Expeditionary Force. We are entering space. To any still receiving this transmission, hold on. Help is coming. Stood up so fast that her old joints screamed in protest. She pushed through the crowd toward the communication console, not believing what she had heard, not daring to believe it. That's impossible, someone was saying. The humans are too far away. They're a minor species. They don't have a fleet strong enough to fight the... But was not listening. She was staring at the console, waiting for the voice to speak again, because she recognized that voice. She knew it, even after 32 years. She had heard it whisper, "I won't forget you," in a ship's medical bay, so long ago that it felt like another lifetime. Had kept her promise. The shelter erupted in chaos. People were shouting, crying, praying to gods they had forgotten. Someone grabbed her arm and asked her what was happening, who these humans were, why they were coming. Did not answer. She could not speak. She could only stand there with tears running down her face, something she had not done since she was a child. Because she understood now what had meant all those years ago. Humans remembered their debts. Humans kept their promises. Humans did not forget. And they had come to repay what they owed. Outside the shelter, far above the burning world, the sky began to fill with new ships. Not ships, human ships. Hundreds of them dropping out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, their weapons already powering up. The battle of the burning sky was about to begin. Admiral stood on the bridge of the UHS Remembrance and watched the fleet on her tactical display. There were a lot of them, more than intelligence had predicted. They had brought enough firepower to crush a dozen worlds, and they had already used most of it on the planet below. She was 61 years old now. Her hair had turned gray, and her face was lined with wrinkles that hadn't been there when she was young. She walked with a slight limp from an injury she'd gotten 20 years ago in a battle that no one remembered anymore. She had spent her entire adult life preparing for this moment, and now that it was here, she felt strangely calm. Her tactical officer, a young man named Lieutenant, looked up from his console. "Admiral, the flagship is hailing us. They want to know what we're doing here." Smiled, it was not a friendly smile. "Put them through." The main display flickered, and a commander appeared. He was tall and with compound eyes that reflected the light in 1,000 tiny mirrors. His mandibles clicked together as he spoke, the universal translator turning his words into flat galactic common. "Human vessel, you are interfering with a legal military operation. This is now territory of the Dominion. You will withdraw immediately or face destruction." Looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the messages she had intercepted on the way here, all the species who had expressed their sympathy and done nothing, all the politicians who had explained that it wasn't their problem, wasn't their responsibility, wasn't their fight. "You're right," she said. "This isn't our war. They aren't our allies. We have no treaty that requires us to be here. According to galactic law, we have no reason to interfere." The commander's mandibles relaxed slightly. "Then you understand. Withdraw your forces and there will be no consequences." "I'm not finished," stepped forward and her voice turned to ice. 32 years ago, a merchant captain saved my life. She didn't have to, she wasn't required to, but she stopped her ship and pulled me out of a wreck on a frozen moon because it was the right thing to do. I told her I would repay that debt, so here I am." She let that sink in for a moment. "This wasn't our war, now it is, and you're going to learn something about humans today, something that the rest of the galaxy seems to have forgotten. We don't forget our friends, we don't abandon people who helped us, and we don't respond to kindness with proportional gratitude." She leaned forward. "We respond with everything we have." She cut the communication. "All ships," she said into the fleet-wide channel, "engage." The Battle of the Burning Sky lasted 6 hours. Later, historians would study it as one of the most remarkable military engagements in galactic history. They had superior numbers and firepower. Their ships were larger, their weapons more powerful, their shields stronger. By every logical calculation, they should have won. But they had never fought humans before. Human ships were smaller and faster. They moved in ways that the targeting computers couldn't predict, darting between enemy formations like wolves among cattle. Human pilots took risks that no sane species would consider, flying through fields of debris and radiation, using planets and moons as cover, appearing from impossible angles to strike at vulnerable points. And humans refused to die when they were supposed to. They destroyed a dozen human ships in the first hour. They expected the humans to retreat, to reconsider, to realize they were outmatched. Instead, the remaining ships fought harder. When their weapons were gone, they rammed enemy vessels. When their engines failed, they drifted into firing positions and kept shooting until their reactors went critical. Watched her people die and felt her heart break with every ship lost, but she also felt something else: pride. Because this was what it meant to be human. This was what they did when the people they loved were in danger. They fought until there was nothing left to fight with. The turning point came in the 4th hour. A squadron of human destroyers, led by a captain named, broke through the defensive line and reached the enemy flagship. They were outnumbered 10-1. They should have been destroyed in minutes. Instead, they concentrated all their fire on a single point in the flagship's shields. It was a desperate gamble, a calculation that only made sense if you were willing to sacrifice everything for a chance at victory. The shields failed. The flagship's reactor went critical. When it exploded, it took out 3 other capital ships that were too close to escape the blast radius. The formation shattered. What had been an organized fleet became a scattered collection of panicked ships, each one trying to save itself. The human fleet fell on them like predators on wounded prey. By the 6th hour, the remaining ships were in full retreat, abandoning the conquest they had thought was certain. Stood on her bridge and watched them run. She was exhausted. She had lost 40 ships and over 3,000 people, but she had won. Against all odds, against every rational expectation, she had won. "Lieutenant," she said, "open a channel to the planet. Let them know it's over." The next morning took a shuttle down to the surface. The planet was devastated. Cities were burning. The air was thick with smoke and ash. Bodies lay in the streets, covered with the gray dust that had once been buildings and homes and lives. She walked through the ruins until she found the shelter where the survivors had gathered. The entrance was blocked with debris, and it took her team an hour to clear a path. When they finally broke through, they found hundreds of huddled in the darkness, blinking at the sudden light. Searched through the crowd until she found her. The merchant captain who had pulled her from a frozen moon 32 years ago. She was old now, her scales faded to white, her body bent with age. But her eyes were the same, would have recognized those eyes anywhere. She walked toward her. The crowd parted to let her through. Everyone was silent, watching, waiting. Stopped in front of. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then slowly lowered herself to her knees, her old injury making the movement painful, and looked up at the woman who had saved her life. "I told you I wouldn't forget," she said. Stared at her, tears were running down her face, something had never seen her do before. "You came," she whispered. "You actually came, after all these years, after everything." "Always," said. "That's what we do. That's what humans do. You saved my life when you didn't have to. Did you really think I would let your world burn?" Reached down and touched his face with her clawed hand. "I thought it was just words. I thought you would forget." Shook her head. "Humans don't forget, we never forget." She took his hand in both of her own. "Your debt is paid, but more than that, you have a friend now, a friend who will never abandon you, a friend who will fight for you until the stars go dark." She stood up and turned to face the rest of the survivors. "They are gone," she announced. "They won't be coming back. And as long as the United Human Systems exists, as long as there is a single human left alive in this galaxy, no one will threaten your world again. This I promise. This I swear." In the darkness of the shelter, surrounded by the survivors of a genocide that had almost succeeded, a new alliance was born. Not from treaties or politics or strategic calculation, from gratitude, from loyalty, from a debt repaid 1,000-fold. And the galaxy would never be the same. The Galactic Council chambers on Nexus Prime were enormous. They had been built 10,000 years ago to hold representatives from every major species in known space. The ceiling was so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top. The floor was a vast circular platform surrounded by rising tiers of seats, each section decorated in the colors and symbols of a different civilization. Ambassador David stood at the speaker's podium in the center of this vast space and looked at the beings who had let the burn. 6 months had passed since the Battle of the Burning Sky. The human fleet had not left. Instead, it had grown. More ships arrived every week, establishing a permanent defense perimeter around space. Human engineers worked alongside survivors to rebuild shattered cities. Human doctors treated the wounded and the traumatized. Human diplomats helped organize relief efforts and track down scattered refugees. The galaxy had expected the humans to celebrate their victory and go home. That was what young species did. They won their battles, enjoyed their glory, and returned to their own affairs. They didn't stay. They didn't get involved in galactic politics. They knew their place. But humans, the galaxy was learning, didn't know their place at all. "This council," Ambassador said, his voice echoing through the vast chamber, was founded on the principle that all civilized species share a responsibility to maintain peace and order in the galaxy. That's what the charter says. I've read it. I've memorized every word. He paused and looked around at the assembled representatives. The delegation shifted uncomfortably in their liquid tanks. They clicked their beaks in nervous patterns. The Pelion Assembly representatives stared straight ahead, refusing to meet his eyes. When they invaded, 3 billion people died in the first wave. 3 billion. That's more than the entire population of some species represented in this chamber. And what did this council do? He waited, no one answered. You sent messages of sympathy. You expressed your concerns. You offered to accept refugees if any survived. And then you did nothing. You watched a genocide happen in real time and you decided it wasn't your problem. The representative, a tall named, rose from his seat. They had no defense treaties, no alliances. Under galactic law, our military action was entirely legal. The humans had no right to interfere. Turn to face him. You're absolutely correct. We had no legal right, no treaty obligation, no strategic reason to get involved. They meant nothing to us politically. They had nothing we needed. They couldn't offer us anything in return. He smiled, and there was something dangerous in that smile. We came anyway. We came because one of our people owed a debt to one of theirs. We came because a merchant captain stopped her ship 32 years ago to save a dying human, and we decided that kindness deserves an answer. We came because that's what humans do. He stepped away from the podium and walked toward the center of the floor, where everyone could see him clearly. And now we're going to talk about the future, because we're not leaving. And we're not going back to being a minor species that minds its own business while the rest of you watch civilizations burn. The chamber erupted. Representatives were shouting, clicking, buzzing in a dozen different languages. The translation system struggled to keep up, waited patiently until the noise died down. We're proposing new statutes, he continued. Mutual defense obligations, intervention protocols, a rapid response fleet composed of vessels from all member species, capable of responding to threats anywhere in the galaxy within hours. No more standing by while the innocent die. No more excuses about legal technicalities. The ambassador rose from his tank, water dripping from his gills. Such measures would be expensive. They would require significant resources from every member species, and they would limit our freedom of action in our own territories. Yes, said they would. The established powers will never agree to such constraints. Nodded slowly. Then we'll build it ourselves. We'll create our own alliance with species who believe that helping others is more important than protecting their freedom to do nothing. We'll establish our own defense network, our own rapid response fleet, our own standards of conduct. He looked around the chamber again, making eye contact with as many representatives as he could. And we'll remember who stood with us. We'll remember who joined us when we asked for help, who contributed ships and resources and personnel to protect the weak and the vulnerable. His voice hardened. And we'll remember who didn't. The chamber was silent now. Every representative understood what he was saying. The humans were not just proposing a policy change. They were proposing a fundamental restructuring of galactic politics. Those who joined them would have powerful allies. Those who refused would have powerful enemies. You can't threaten us, the representative said. You're a young species. You've been in space for 300 years. We've been a galactic power for. Turn to face him one last time. You're right. We're young. We're inexperienced. We don't have the wealth or the history or the influence of the established powers. He stepped closer to the delegation. But we do have one thing you don't. We have friends. Real friends. People who will fight and die for us, not because of treaties or trade agreements, but because we earned their loyalty through blood and sacrifice. They are our friends now, and every species that joins our alliance will become our friend too. He turned and walked back toward the podium. That's the human way. We remember our friends, we remember our enemies, and we never ever forget. He gathered his materials and prepared to leave. You have 6 months to decide where you stand. After that, the lines will be drawn and the galaxy will move forward with you or without you. I suggest you choose carefully. He walked out of the chamber without looking back. Over the following months, the galaxy began to change. Some species, impressed by human determination or ashamed of their own inaction, joined the new alliance. Others, afraid of retaliation or unwilling to commit resources, stayed neutral. A few openly opposed the humans, calling them reckless and aggressive and dangerous. But more and more species began to remember their own debts. They had been helped by human traders during a famine. They had received human medical assistance during a plague. They had been rescued by a human patrol when their colony ship suffered engine failure. Each of these species had been waiting for a reason to repay what they owed. The humans gave them that reason. Within a year, the Terran Alliance had grown from 2 species to 12. Within 5 years, it had grown to 30. The rapid response fleet that the established powers had called impossible now numbered over 1,000 ships, crewed by beings from dozens of different worlds, united by a simple principle. When someone needs help, you help them. And at the center of it all stood humanity, the young species that had refused to accept the way things were, the species that remembered their debts, the species that never forgot. The galaxy would never be the same, and that was exactly what the humans intended. 200 years had passed since the Battle of the Burning Sky. The Memorial Plaza on Nu was beautiful. It had been built on a hill overlooking the capital city, surrounded by gardens filled with purple flowers that bloomed year-round. At the center of the plaza stood a statue made of white stone and silver metal, depicting 2 figures frozen in time. The first figure was a young human woman, thin and weak, her clothes torn and her skin marked by frostbite. The second was a merchant captain, her clawed hand extended to help the human to her feet. They were looking at each other, and even in stone, you could see the connection between them. The moment when 2 strangers became something more. Beneath the statue, an inscription had been carved in 17 different languages. The same words repeated over and over, so that every species in the Alliance could read them. Aid a human once, they'll never forget, and their comeback might astonish you. Ambassador stood before the statue and felt the weight of history pressing down on her. She was 34 years old, with dark hair and sharp eyes and the same stubborn jaw that had defined her family for generations. She was the great-great-granddaughter of the admiral who had brought a fleet across the galaxy to repay a debt. She had grown up hearing stories about that day, about the woman who had refused to let her friends die alone. Now she was here, on the anniversary of the battle, representing humanity in the ceremony that marked everything that had changed. Standing beside her was High Speaker the Younger, named for the ancestor who had started it all. She was tall and graceful, her scales a deep green that marked her as being in the prime of her life. She led the people now, the latest in a long line of leaders who had worked alongside humans to build something new. "It's strange," said, looking up at the statue. "My ancestor saved one woman, just one person on a frozen moon in the middle of nowhere. She didn't think it was important. She didn't think it would matter." Nodded. "That's the thing about humans. Small things matter to us. A single act of kindness can echo through generations. A single debt can reshape the galaxy." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the crowds gather in the plaza below. Humans and walked together, their children playing games that combined elements from both cultures. Ships from a dozen different species flew overhead in formation, their lights creating patterns against the darkening sky. The Terran Alliance had grown beyond anything its founders could have imagined. 60 species now belonged to it, bound together not by conquest or fear but by a shared commitment to help each other. The Rapid Response Fleet numbered 10,000 ships, crewed by beings from every corner of the galaxy. When someone sent a distress signal, help came, always, without exception. The Dominion had been dismantled 40 years ago. Their empire had collapsed from within, weakened by decades of resistance from species who had once been too afraid to fight back. The final war had lasted only 2 years. When it was over, the worlds had been liberated and their leaders tried for crimes against sentient life. Humans had led that war too, and once again they had remembered everything. Every species they had conquered, every world they had burned, every debt that needed to be repaid. My ancestor used to talk about the day your people arrived, said. She said she had given up hope. She was sitting in a dark shelter, listening to bombs fall, knowing that no one was coming to help. And then she heard Admiral's voice on the communication channel, and she knew everything was going to be different. Smiled. My great-great-grandmother talked about it too. She said it was the proudest moment of her life, not because she won a battle but because she kept a promise. The ceremony began as the sun set over the horizon. Speakers from both species shared memories and stories. Children read poems they had written about courage and friendship. Musicians played songs that blended human melodies with harmonics, creating something beautiful and new. When it was turn to speak, she walked to the podium and looked out at the crowd. Thousands of faces looked back at her, human but also dozens of others, all of them part of something that had started with a single act of kindness on a frozen moon. 200 years ago, she said, a merchant captain named made a choice. She could have continued on her journey and left a dying stranger behind. No one would have blamed her. No one would have known. But she stopped. She helped. She saved a life that didn't matter to anyone except the person living it. She paused and looked up at the statue. That woman was my ancestor, and when she was rescued, she made a promise. She said she would never forget. She said she would repay the debt. And 32 years later, when there was burning, she brought a fleet across the galaxy to keep that promise. She turned back to the crowd. That's who we are. That's who humans have always been. We remember. We remember kindness and we remember cruelty. We remember our friends and we remember our enemies. And we respond to both with everything we have. She gestured at the ships flying overhead, at the crowds filling the plaza, at the city shining in the distance. Look at what we built. Look at what happened because one person decided to help another. An alliance that spans 60 species. A fleet that protects the weak and challenges the strong. A galaxy where no one has to face darkness alone anymore. She stepped back from the podium. That's the human way. Aid us once and we'll never forget, and our comeback might astonish you. The crowd erupted in applause that seemed to shake the ground, walked back to where was standing and took her place beside her old friend. Your people are terrifying, said, but there was warmth in her voice. Laughed, only to our enemies, to our friends were the best thing that ever happened to them. Above them, human and ships flew side by side, as they had for 200 years. Their lights blazed against the darkness like stars that had decided to come closer to the ground. In the plaza, humans danced together, their movements synchronized in a way that would have seemed impossible 2 centuries ago. On the statue, the 2 figures remained frozen in their eternal moment. A human being helped to her feet, extending her hand, the beginning of everything. And beneath them, the inscription glowed in the fading light. Aid a human once, they'll never forget, and their comeback might astonish you. The galaxy had learned that lesson well, and as long as humans existed, as long as they drew breath and traveled the stars, they would continue to teach it. To their friends, they offered loyalty that lasted beyond death. To their enemies, they offered a reckoning that never ended. That was the human way, and the universe would never forget it.